just 12 miles north of Cambridge, 4 miles south of Ely. I'm looking out of my window across the garden, across the road, and between me and that garden is a computer screen, which is what you can see in front of you. And on that computer screen, I've shared all sorts of information. And we're going to share and explore some of that information. But in the next little while, virtually everything you see on the device in front of you, you actually have on the device in front of you. So that everything that you're going to see is already online and you can already access it. Now, I've been asked to look back over my involvement with local history, and it starts here in 1949. Now, in 1949, I was staying with an auntie in Holbeach, and I was sent a picture postcard of my village. It was an old picture postcard by the time I received it. It had been taken in about 1935. I must have looked at that picture and thought, it's different from what I know. I must have looked at it in 1949. I still have it. I still look at it. I've been then collecting material for the last 70 years. Today, every child in Streatham School has that picture on their tablet or computer, together with another 1,700 pictures of Streatham in different times. It is a wonderful way to save information, and hopefully other 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds will be discovering something and taking an interest in their locality. When I went to the top school at the end of the road, our head teacher then, Mr. Blackmore, wrote a history of Streatham. And I was so excited to think, I've got a head teacher who's written a history. But in fact, he hadn't. What he'd done was to take a lecture, a history of Streatham written by the Reverend Stitt in 1922, following a talk to the WI, and got it retyped. Now, at this time, typewriters were a very modern technology and nobody had a typewriter, but he got the secretary of the Isle of Ely County Librarian to type it up. So this introduced the fact that libraries can share information. Today, every child in Streatham and all of you have that same history of Streatham, but this time as it appeared in the Ely Standard for 1922. In fact, you have many of the articles that appeared in the Ely Standard in 1922 on your device. You can just flick through them. Today, they will also have a number of other histories of Streatham. One is a millennium history that we put together, a team of us, including Tom Doig and Alison Taylor and Beth Davis, bringing together the skills of the curator and the archaeologist and the buildings person. But that is exceeded by another history of Streatham written by Mrs. Stevens, a local girl who grew up in the village, who became the village correspondent for the Ely Standard. And one of the things we were able to help her do was to help her put together a book which really captures the proper village, the proper people. She takes you into their houses. It's a wonderful book. And it's on every screen. After Streatham, I went to Sarum Grammar School, where I discovered that there were such things as libraries where people sat and worked, and there were books that they could read there for nothing. And from that, I moved on to Cambridge Public Library, where I discovered that this public library also had books that people could come and use, and that you didn't have to be academic or old to use them. It's a service that was open to all, young and old, for free, just by walking into the building. I discovered that in the mid-1960s, but then I discovered that that library had been there already for over 110 years. It had been set up in 1855 under the stewardship of John Pink, Cambridge's first librarian. And the very first books that had been given to that library had been given by Charles Henry Cooper, Charles Henry Cooper was a local lad who'd married a Pricklow girl, but gone on to be town clerk of Cambridge and had written a massive 4-volume Annals of Cambridge that he presented. He was later to go on and produce a 5th volume. Those books were proudly displayed around the edge of the public reading room. You could look under the glass mesh, the cases, and you could see what was there. By 1901, it was being praised as one of the great local studies libraries, typical of what libraries ought to do, to collect everything, every scrap published on their locality. Not just books, but newspapers. That chap who's looking with his bowler hat at the Cambridge Chronicle, he's long since gone. That paper is still there in Cambridge Library, and people can still use it. But by the time I got there in the mid-1960s, that library had been forgotten for 50 years. I discovered it tucked away in a small room off the back of the library. I got there in early one morning and saw the door and wondered what was behind that door. And being inquisitive, and that's not the same as nosy, I went into that room. It was a long, thin room that was filled from floor to ceiling with books. And as I looked along the shelves, I saw a book that I recognised because my granddad had it. My granddad was the village mole catcher. That's being posh. He was the village rat catcher. But if you're talking to Cambridge folk, you've got to be posh. And he, being a Fen boy, didn't have too much time for reading, but he did have 2 books. And one was a book on boxing, and the other was a history of the Fens. It brought to life for him the area that he knew, 5 miles from anywhere up where. And there on the shelves was Grandad's book, because Grandad had a copy. And alongside it, there were other books on the fence. And across the room, there were books on education, and then there were books on folklore, and then there were storybooks, and then there were poetry books. And the thing that united all those books was they were all about Cambridgeshire. They'd been there for 110 years. They'd never been sorted. I decided then that that was an interesting way to spend a fortnight. And I spent the next 30 odd years sifting and sorting. It was a locked away resource that was forgotten, but we got it remembered because I was at the time attending a WEA class on the history of the Fens at Hadnam. Now, attending WEA classes can be dangerous. It was there I met my wife. And everything that happened after that, it is not me, it is us. One of the things that we arranged was for Hadnam WEA class to come to the library on one of those nights when we were open to 9 and to go through the volumes of old newspapers to see what they could discover about their locality. And that initiated an idea, well, why don't we use other volunteers to go through the old papers, to index the news for every village in Cambridgeshire and the Isle of Ely between 1770 and 1900, and that was done. And then we started to produce chronicles. Other people copied out those stories to produce village chronicles, a summary of newspaper stories relating to their locality. The first was Streatham, and it went on to be something that other people took up until there were a score or so different chronicles for Pampisford and Fulbourn, and those index cards were deemed so important that Chadwick Healy microfiched them as part of their national inventory of documentary sources, which went around the world to all the major university libraries who subscribed. One of the other things I learned from Hadnam was that in 1947 there'd been a flood. I didn't know about the 1947 floods. I'd been around, but and perhaps Dad and Mum said if it rains one more day you'll get wet. But I hadn't realised that we'd lost 100 square miles of Fenland in 1947. But one man had travelled round with the army to take photographs of them. So picking up my courage, I knocked on his door, and then later knocked on his door again. The sitting librarian forked out £30 so that we could buy 300 of his photographs. He deposited the rest of his collection at the library. It was deposited at an exhibition in the small hall of the Cambridge Guildhall with the mayor in attendance and the chairman in attendance and the library. It brought to people's recognition that Cambridge had a collection that was expanding. And more importantly, it brought into people's minds that this was a collection that would have been lost had this man not chosen to pass it on to Cambridge Library. We took it back to Haddenham, of course, and we got the local people to tell us what was being shown, who it was in the boat and all the details. Putting those things together and increasing a public awareness meant that when in 1975 a new public library opened, that new public library in Lion Yard had a suite of rooms devoted to the Cambridgeshire collection. This collection that had been forgotten in a cupboard now was being inspected by royalty and chairman and you would think that this was the end of that albatross, that inheritance that had seemed too much for libraries to sort. But sadly it wasn't. 1975 was a year after local government reorganisation, which had brought together various county libraries, Cambridgeshire, Huntingdon, Peterborough and the Isle of Ely. And the idea we could all pull them together. But no, because management decreed that that new joint library should be split into areas and each area should be self-sufficient. We were told to stop collecting material on Streatham because Streatham wasn't our patch. We ignored it. We carried on until such time as the other areas had a collection. They never did. That is explained a bit in Albatross Inheritance. We established a heritage showcase. You see, under reorganisation, under this new thing, I was a librarian, there was a curator and there was an archaeologist and there was a listed buildings person and we weren't able to talk. We were in separate institutions, as it were, within the county. So as officers, we came together and we pooled our exhibitions to establish a heritage showcase, which every organisation put on a display, which they changed once a month so that there was always something different. It was used for a variety of things, as to the launch of Sylvia Beeman's book on Royston Cave. And it was opened again in the presence of the chairman. But the opening was sabotaged when somebody walked in saying, "Where's my bike? I'm looking for my bike." And that was Dennis a Grunty Fen. Dennis a Grunty Fen and Tone Up. Because of course our history is not just ancient history, it is people and it is folklore, and it gives an idea of, while that heritage centre room showcase was working, it enabled the various departments to pull together. Another important room that we set up was a teaching area, just out the back into the stack area. And that was a place where children could come as a class. It wasn't big enough for an entire class. So one half studied about their locality. They looked up the county directories, and the other half were given a tour of the rest of the resources of the collection. The ones that had given the tour didn't want stopping touring, and the ones that were doing the work didn't want to stop work, but they did. They swapped over halfway. You can see the impact that that's having on those young faces. It's getting children involved with their, not just history, their geography, their planning, their archaeology, their grasses, and their... A history teacher from Manor School was seconded to the collection to do a summary of the resources that could be used with secondary school. The Open University Sue Westhaven, used the collection to launch their work on CD-ROMs. Homerton College featured the collection in a video as to how to teach local history. That video is online. It's on YouTube. You can watch it. But that left the major part of the room, not the place where the things were stored, but the place where people came and used. And by the 1990s, 1,000 people every month were making the journey to Cambridge to make some sort of use of the material that John Pink and the others had set down and collected for them. Material that was now organised, because for a decade I'd sat in that room and I had read every book and catalogued every chapter, looked at every East Anglian magazine, catalogued every article to produce a card catalogue. So if you wanted material on Pampersford or Shelford, or you could just open the drawer under P or S or H for Hadnam, and then you could make your list selection from the list. Because there's more than one book on any topic, there are a whole variety of different, and you really need to spend time just deciding which one you want to start with, because obviously time is limited. And that really worked well, but things changed. A new management team had in mind changes that I couldn't endorse, and neither could I stop. And I had the opportunity to take a package, and I took a package. I took as my leaving present a balloon trip to remind me of all those management meetings. It was a heady time when we were getting awards from Anglia and the University of Cambridge, but the greatest thing that I got was the agreement that I could take copies of things from the collection for the work and the talks that I was given, and that I could rent an office in the management corridor, which is what I did. I came back to the library as a paid up renter of a space. And day after day, I went back into that collection to build up resources and to help make. And I just kept going on, going and going, until every moment, the day that was nearing that things were going to change. I went into that room for the day before the big change was taking place. As I was in there working, there was a power cut. The whole room plunged into blackness. I walked out. The next time, some months later, that I peeped into that room, it was empty. Even the office where we'd sat and talked to people was knocked down. Since then, that collection has undergone a terrible time. It's moved virtually constantly. It's had several moves up and downstairs, and for a long period, the entire library was shut down during a botched management reorganisation. It finally emerged back on the 3rd floor with a much larger storage area on the 2nd floor, so that there was now proper space for all the accumulated material. How Chris Jakes, my successor, former colleague, has managed to survive the trauma of constant moves, and I have the greatest respect for him. But the collection is now back, at least in part, in the space that it once. And what was the most remarkable thing was that proposals to take it away from Cambridge Central Library and put it somewhere else, put it in the archive centre behind Tesco petrol station in Ely, was defeated. Not defeated by management, but defeated by people who said, no, this is a library resource, it should stay a library resource. One thing that is missing is that catalogue. that card catalogue with all the cards that describe the contents of each article. It's been replaced with a computerized version that doesn't work. Previously, all those cards, in the same way as the news index had been microfished. There is a microfiche edition, so it's not all lost. And over the last few months, I have reformatted all those articles, entries from the library catalogue online into a one-volume Cambridgeshire bibliography, which is on your computer. It's the easier way to discover what's been published about places. Not complete, but nothing's complete. There are a couple of others. One, for most complete, is this wonderful collection of Cambridge in Books, a catalogue that was produced by Pierre Gorman of the collection that he deposited in Melbourne University Library. That's on your computer. For Cambridgeshire, you've got the Fen and the Furrow, this wonderful catalogue of books in the collections of the Isle of Ely and Cambridgeshire County Library that was published just after reorganisation. There's still copies of that about. It's massively out of date, but in your hand, you can just look and see a list of at least some of the county story. But there are other libraries. One of those, of course, is the great Cambridge University Library. And Cambridge University Library has been collecting books for centuries over all aspects of knowledge. I had the opportunity to investigate it. They didn't have many of the more recent publications, the pamphlets and leaflets that had been issued on Cambridgeshire. But they did have other things. They had their own subscription to web services and to digital information that the rest of us can't get to. And with the privilege that I had at the time of a Raven password, it meant that from home, from this desk, I could not only search the digital resources that the university subscribed to, but I could also read them and I could download them. I could download and read the reports of the Poor Law Commissioners on the women and children in agriculture. I could download the Acts of Parliament for preserving land in Whittlesea. I could download so many of those drainage reports from the 1700s and before that we'd forgotten about. And so on my collection, on this catalogue on this computer here, I have something like 2,000 books, many of which are not in the Cambridgeshire collection. Where they are, of course, is on a memory stick that I carry around with me. Because these days, libraries can travel with you. You can find libraries wherever you are resting your head if you've got a computer that you can plug it into. I went on to publish other things myself. A number of books, the most significant of which was the one I produced in 1988 when I was invited by the Cambridge News to produce a pictorial history of their paper. I decided that I couldn't produce a pictorial history of their paper if I didn't know what the paper had published. The Cambridge News gave me a word processor and I started to build up a record of stories that had been published about birds and trees and planning and transport and all the various aspects that make up Cambridge. I also, once I had retired, increased the articles. I'd been writing 1 or 2 articles a week. I increased it to 4 or 5 articles a week. They covered all sorts of topics, memories, reminiscences, stories from a year, and you have them on your computer. because the text of all those articles is on a file that you can just, if it's any use to you, just search it or read it. And it's not what I wrote that's important, it's what people shared with me, the people who wrote in. And we also wrote a series of Mr. Pickwick's Cambridge Scrapbook, which for 750 weeks, 750 weeks, we turned the pages of an imaginary scrapbook for 1838, but using contemporary resources, reconstructed the real people who were really existed and the things that they could really tell you. That Pickwick scrapbook is on your computer and to this day is being reproduced with illustrations on my Pickwick's Cambridge scrapbook on Facebook. But there are other libraries as well. And one of those was the library that had been built up by the Cambridge News. Now, the Cambridge collection had taken cuttings from the 1960s, but the Cambridge Evening News had taken cuttings and recorded everything that had been published in their paper. It was a service that they were producing for their journalists. But because I was working on the history of the Cambridge News and because of the kindness of the news and the librarians, I was able to have access to that collection. Amongst the things that they had was, of course, thousands of photographs. Newspapers have been an amazing source of photographs. They cover villages, they cover transport, they cover all aspects of life. And they had files, file after file after file after file of newspapers. There were 2 folders of pictures of Streatham, Wilburton, Haddenham, Sutton, you name it, which I was able to access and to appreciate. And some of those are on your computer, not just for Streatham, but for many of the other topics. But as well as those prints, the library also had negatives. The journalists, the photographers had jotted down in big ledgers where they had gone on what day and what they had taken. So that if you wanted pictures of Sawston or Swaffham Priory and you knew from the cuttings that they had visited and done an article, you could look up that particular year in the ledger and it would give you a negative reference. And from that, you could go to the negative files. And then you would find that when they went and photographed, they didn't take one photograph, they took several, only 1 or 2 of which they published. Those negatives were all there. Many, many, many of them were 35mm negatives, but they also had a large quantity of older 2 1/4 square negatives. So for week after week, I went into the Cambridge News. I worked through those files of negatives. I placed them on a light box and I re-photographed them so that I could build up an index and a record of some of the topics. It's easy if you know what you want. If you want a picture of Streatham, you go straight to Streatham. But if you don't know what you want, but you just want something that captures spirit, then that. And those pictures, many of them, are on your computer. They cover a whole eclectic range of things that they're not of a quality that you can reproduce in a magazine or a book, but they tell you what exists and they give you a reference number so that and those pictures themselves are no longer in Cambridge. Those negatives and the photographs are now in Watford. They're part of the Mirror Pics archive. And mirror pics are in process of digitizing a few hundred of them and are on their websites, so that you can search for Cambridgeshire or you can search for anywhere, Hampshire or whatever. And mirror pics have now allowed you to take copies for non-commercial purposes for free from their site. But they've only done a few score of many thousand. Pictures are just one part. As well as files of pictures, the Cambridge News librarians built up thousands of files of newspaper cuttings on Ely, on Straightboarding, on Lion Yard, on file after file, shelf after shelf, drawer after. I was working in the Cambridge News Library. By then, all the staff had gone. The library had just been abandoned, when the man from Watford came to collect all the photographs to take down to his archive. And I said to him, what are you going to do with these thousands of files of cuttings? He said, they're no use to us. We're going to dump them. I said, don't dump them. Give them to me. Which he did. And I, in turn, have passed them on to the Cambridge Independent, whose offices are virtually next door to those that the Cambridge News used to occupy. Cambridge Independent have promised that those files will be available to researchers, that you can have access to them. But like everybody else, they've been badly hit by COVID, and so they've not been able to move ahead as quickly as they would wish. In that way, we have managed to save much of the hard work that the librarians of the Cambridge News had put in for over 50 years. One of the other things that they had done was to produce card indexes, drawer after drawer after drawer of card indexes. You could look up under F for flood or T for trees, and there would tell you what article had appeared in which issue of which paper, on which page and which column. And therefore you could turn to the papers on microfilm or and find it. And you can imagine the importance of that resource. I frequently, when I went into that empty library, I would turn up those cards, and one day I went and opened the drawer and it was empty. Those cards had gone overnight. I don't know where they went. Hopefully somewhere, that massive index, but it has currently gone. Fortunately, I had made copies of some of the articles in the index entries, mainly relating to Ely and the villages immediately around Ely, which is the area that I'm really specialised in. But it does give an idea of the amount of detail that they contained. And when I was saving those files, I also copied a number of them, so that on your computer you have their cuttings files for Hadnam and Sutton and Streatham and Littleport, and also certain other major topics like fens and flooding. They are only a dozen or two out of thousands, but they give you an insight to what does exist or did exist. To share information, then I used to do talks Again, when I was working, it would be a talk a week or something. We stepped it up until we're doing 4 talks a week in all areas of Cambridgeshire, to all sorts of groups, from academic groups to important elderly folks group, even to a group of witches, or at least that was the most frightening talk I ever gave. It was at Somersham. It was a talk at Somersham WI. We were talking about ghosts and witches, and the ladies all came dressed up with pointed hats and cobwebs in their hair. But it takes you out to the community. You get to know the community. You get to tell the community about this resource that the community owns, that the community use. We also, in the old days, used to do things on BBC Radio Cambridgeshire, because you might talk to 50 people in a room, but through the radio, you can talk to thousands. And we did special programs, like some wonderful programs called Lester Millbank, Off the Beaten Track, where we went into individual villages and we talked to individual people, and those were issued on CDs or on cassette tapes, which of course can be uploaded to the internet. We haven't done it, but it can be. And of course we worked with TV people, especially in 1940, following 1947. 50 years later was just the time that people were looking back on 50 years of 47. And we contributed with a number of people, a number of different program makers, including one there that you possibly recognise, who was doing a programme on Crown and Country and wanting to tell the story of Cambridgeshire and the royal involvement. The most important of that was that he wanted to tell the story of the 1947 floods. And the most important thing about that was that we introduced him to an elderly gentleman who had been in that flood. And the most important of that was that Prince Edward ended up knocking on that man's front door and going into his lounge and talking to him in his own home and having a cup. It makes people appreciate just the knowledge and the resource that people have out there. The talks continue with a whole variety of ways, and one thing that we did was a series of talks, Fenland History on Friday. It started when I was doing a WA class at Ealing Library, and it was oversubscribed and they were turning people away, and I thought, we can't turn people away. So that after that course had finished, we hired Ealing Library and we did our own series of talks, Fenland History on Friday. People came to us from, we had academic speakers, we had local speakers, we had, well, people like Ken Wallace came and talked to us about flying autogyros. We had academics, we had real Fen men who said, can I give you a talk, Mike? And they would just stand up and talk. The meetings ran every week, October to May, for 13 years. And as well as these meetings, at the end of every session, we organised excursions. So we went to see Ken Wallace's collections of autogyros. We went to inspect the new buildings at Cambridge University, this new mathematical faculty, where the man who had designed it was talking and showing us Fen folk a different world, which is part of Cambridgeshire. We went to one of our attendees, her husband works hiring out the big equipment that helps the farmers on the field. They took us around their farm in a trailer and gave us an insight into the problems of farming. We also, as a group, even went to the Cambridgeshire collection, where Chris Jakes took us into his stack, and we realised just how difficult it was to work there, because he was working, trying to keep up with the mass of material that was coming in a room that had no light. It was like that room that I'd inherited, only it was worse in that, of course, it was air conditioned and kept cold. So he was sitting in a cold room facing a wall, trying to keep up. Great respect. And of course, doing what I did, I was privileged over so many years to meet so many people. People like Bill Thurbin, a clerk at Trinity College, people like Jack Overhill, who really published a fantastic diary recording his life and times, of Sarah Payne, who came up saying, I'm doing this street in the Down Your Street articles this week, Mike, what should we write about? So we would talk through to people, of course, like Mike Farrer and Lorna Delanoy, people like Enid Porter at the Cambridge Folk Museum. Sometimes when sitting in that little cupboard, the telephone would ring and it would be Miss Porter. And she'd be asking me something. I thought, no, so many folk, Roy Burgess here, who saved that film that had been taken by Uncle David and Auntie Flossie when they'd done their Band of Hope excursions around the villages in the 1930s, had saved it and preserved it. And so we managed to get that in the East Anglian Film Archive, and that. And so many people that we've met who were researching have, like everybody, got old. And when they've got old, they've been unable quite to do what they did before. And some have got material and they are disorganized, and their families are frantic, and they are frantic about what is going to happen to their resource. And with the help of people from Will Burton and elsewhere, copies have been taken of thousands of photographs that were collected by people like Garth Collard or Pam Blakeman. Pam Blakeman, the Ely historian, also compiled scrapbooks. They've been copied, every page. Every page is online. You can read Pam's scrapbooks. And one of the most rewarding collections to help through was this collection of negatives that were taken by Brian Lane. And Brian Lane was the son of Walter Lane, who took the 1947 floods. And so most recently, we've gone through and we've listed those negatives, and copies of some of those negatives are, like everything else that you've seen, on your computer. More recently, we've been busy working through papers. I worked through doing a series of articles in the Cambridge News. I read every copy of the Cambridge News for 100 years to produce a column in the Cambridge News each day, which looked back 100 years, 50 years, 25 years, and so on. And that has been reworked in part into a Cambridge Chronicle. Now, a Cambridge Chronicle is a survey of all aspects of Cambridge life from 1888 to 1990. Now, you instantly recognise that it's central Cambridge, but look at the different elements that make up central Cambridge. Look at the church, look at the colleges, look at the university, look at the shops, look at the transport, look at the market, look at the fountain, look at the... A Cambridge Chronicle is divided into sections, a section on telephones, a section on market, a section on shops, a section on trees, a section on planning, a section on war. You can imagine that a Cambridge Chronicle, which is on your computer, is massive. It is 400 pages. Now, I got that wrong. It's not 400 pages at all. It's 4,000 pages. So don't print it all out. But if you are interested in transport, or you're interested in churches, or you are interested in music, then just look at the individual section that covers that. It's not much help to you if you are pursuing a family tree or family information, because it's arranged by subject. If you're producing family in Cambridgeshire, then you need the Cambridgeshire scrapbook, which is another 4,000-page document that you can download from Internet Archive. Do download it, because once you've downloaded it, it's much more easy to search than it is by doing it online. This starts in 1897 and it goes up to 1990. It is not everything that happened and was reported in Cambridge papers, but it is thousands and thousands of the stories that appeared in Cambridge papers. It's arranged in one straight chronological section. So if your family were active in the 1920s or 30s or 50s or 60s or 70s, you can just turn to that period and read something of what was going on. You'll get a summary of the story as it appeared in the paper. But in addition to the summary story, you'll also see there is a page at the start of links. And if you click on those links, you will go to actual copies of the article that I summarized. Not for every year, but as you see, for many years between 1905 and 1990, you've got copies of stories on your laptop, on your tablet. You can literally just on your tablet just flick through page by page by page, and you'll not only get the story that's indexed, but of course you'll get the advertisements and you'll get the bits of stories alongside. And we're still waiting for the Cambridge News to be published online as part of the British Newspaper Archive. That is one of the ideas. But until it happens, the Cambridgeshire Scrapbook is a way into that resource. We share information. We're telling people that there are these things, no longer by stand-up talks, but on Facebook. I have a number of Facebook groups, one of which is Fenland History on Facebook. Fenland History on Facebook doesn't just cover Fenland, it covers Cambridgeshire and the whole of the county. But every day we publish about a dozen articles, extracts on Fenland History on Facebook, which is then relevant ones copied to Cambridge on Facebook and Streatham. And they will give stories. At the moment, I'm working through stories that appeared in the Evening Standard on this particular day in years past, because as well as the ones we've just seen, there are copies of the articles in the Evening Standard from many of the years are also copied and whatever. The other thing that we're currently sharing on Facebook every day are extracts from that fantastic map of the land subject to the Ubrink tax in 1833. A fantastic map which is detailed enough to show the lines of the rivers, the names of fields, that gives you plots of land, and those plots of land relate to a survey which is held at the Record Office. Those posts on Fenland History on Facebook go out to over 10,000 people. And within moments of them being posted, we will have responses. It really has developed to people are commenting on. I put a photograph of farm workers picking peas, and somebody will come back and tell me about the job of picking peas on farm. And other people will come back and they will ask things and people will share things. It really is a fantastic way of sharing. So look at it, and if you're at all interested, join up, become part of the team. It's because, of course, libraries are not just putting people in touch with books. They're also putting people in touch with people. Now, we know we've lost our libraries for so many years, months now, because of COVID and whatever, but this is not an ideal replacement, it is a replacement. And all of this is digital, and all of this is on your computer. But of course, there are also thousands and thousands and thousands of proper books. Many of those have now been digitized by Google Books or by Internet Archive, but many thousands haven't. Books are so fundamental and important, but who these days has books? This Victoria County History, fortunately, is one of the ones that's been digitized. And now I'm into that situation, like so many of the other people that I've helped over the years. I'm not going to be around in 25 years' time. What's going to happen to all this? It's already in the Cambridgeshire collection. County archives don't want it. But then it's dawned on me. It is all on my computer. It's already all on your computer. I think the future must be for me to put it on memory sticks and then to invite anybody who wants their own collection to make a donation to a local society or museum or organisation. Send me a memory stick that's empty. I'll send you one that is absolutely crammed with information. Perhaps this is that the Family History Society might take on and let the people pay a donation to whatever. I've enjoyed looking back over the last 70 plus years. Now I think it's coming near to saying that I've really done enough looking back. I've got one big project to finish, but then I think it'll probably be time to take a break from it all, to sit and ponder on the changes that I've seen and to take an interest in my locality and hope that other people are also taking an interest in, because that was the essence of that idea that John Pink had, to make material available and to share. That's what I do. I'm having fun doing it, and I'm absolutely delighted to be able to share a little bit of it with you. So thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Mike. That's really informative, and it's been very, well, even I found stuff that I didn't know. So it's been very, very interesting. Right. Does anybody have questions? Either put them on the chat or put your hand up or